Writing variant equals document ID equals 58314. I don't want her serving my table. Richard Calloway said it without even looking at Avery Johnson. The words crossed the private dining room like a cold draft, slipping between crystal glasses, polished silverware, and the quiet conversations of people who had spent their lives learning when to laugh at a powerful man's joke. Avery stood beside the table with a notepad in her hand, her black uniform pressed neatly, her posture calm. She had been holding a tray of sparkling water. Now, for one brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath with her. Richard, a white CEO whose company was worth more than most people could imagine, finally glanced in her direction. His eyes moved over her uniform, then toward the restaurant manager. "Send someone else," he said. "Someone more appropriate." No one asked what he meant. They understood. Avery did too. The manager, a nervous man named Daniel, hurried toward her with an apologetic expression that said more than words could. "Avery, maybe take the next section." She looked at him, then at Richard. She had heard versions of that sentence before. Different restaurants, different offices, different excuses. Sometimes people called it image. Sometimes they called it standards. Sometimes they smiled while making sure she understood exactly what they meant. Avery had learned that humiliation rarely arrived wearing a name tag. More often, it came dressed as a preference. She lowered her eyes for half a second, not in surrender, but to set the tray down carefully. The glass made a soft sound against the table. Richard turned back to his guests, already treating her as though she had disappeared. He began discussing a $400 million acquisition, his voice smooth and confident, the kind of voice people listened to because money had taught them to. Avery stepped away. Then she stopped. On the table beside Richard's leather portfolio lay a thick contract, open near the middle. She had not intended to read it. But one phrase caught her attention. A phrase she had seen years earlier, during long nights in a financial compliance office, when she had still worn a blazer instead of an apron. Her eyes moved across the page, then back again. The room continued talking around her. Richard lifted a pen. Avery looked at the signature line. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her notepad. She could walk away. She had every reason to. The man had just made it clear that, in his eyes, she was not worthy of serving his table. Boo. By the time Avery stepped away from Richard Calloway's table, the sound of his voice had already swallowed the moment. He was talking about expansion, investors, and a $400 million acquisition, as if numbers that large belonged naturally in the air around him. Avery moved through the dining room with the same steady pace she had used all evening, carrying a fresh tray of water toward another table. No one looking at her would have guessed that, several years earlier, she had spent long nights reviewing financial reports under fluorescent office lights, comparing columns of numbers until the figures blurred. No one would have guessed that she had once been the person executives called when a contract did not make sense. And no one at Richard Calloway's table knew that she had not chosen restaurant work because she lacked ambition. She had chosen it because life had asked her to begin again. Her mother had been sick for nearly 2 years. Avery had taken time away from her career to care for her, sitting beside hospital windows before sunrise, learning the sound of machines, the smell of antiseptic, and the quiet rhythm of waiting rooms. After her mother passed away, the career Avery had built was gone. The contacts had moved on. The industry had changed. The doors she once knew how to open no longer opened for her. So she took the job at the restaurant. It was supposed to be temporary. Then 1 month became 6. 6 became a year. And somewhere along the way, Avery learned that people revealed themselves more clearly when they believed no one important was watching. She had watched wealthy customers speak politely to managers and dismissively to servers. She had watched people change their tone when they saw a suit, a watch, or a company logo. She had learned not to confuse being ignored with being invisible. As she returned to the service station, her eyes drifted once more toward Richard's table. He was still holding the contract. The leather portfolio beside him looked expensive enough to cost more than her monthly rent. His guests leaned toward him whenever he spoke. Richard did not need to raise his voice. His position did that for him. Avery knew men like him. Not personally, perhaps, but she knew the pattern. They believed respect moved downward. They believed the person carrying the tray should never be the person with the answer. She had spent years learning how systems worked, how language hid responsibility, and how a single sentence buried inside a contract could change the future of an entire company. The phrase she had seen on Richard's document still lingered in her mind. She had seen it before. Years ago, during a compliance review, the same structure had appeared in a case that nearly destroyed a small business. Avery had stayed late that night, reading every page until she understood what everyone else had missed. Now she looked toward Richard again. He was smiling as one of his guests raised a glass. The pen was still in his hand. Avery could have let him sign. She could have told herself that people who treated her like she was beneath them did not deserve her help. But her mother had once told her something Avery had never forgotten. Your character is what you do when nobody is rewarding you for it. Avery slowly picked up her notepad. Then she walked back toward the table. Richard noticed her this time. His expression tightened. I thought I made myself clear. Avery stopped a few feet away. She looked at the contract, then at him. You did. The room seemed to quiet around them. Richard tapped the pen against the paper. Then why are you still here? Avery took one breath. Because you are about to sign something you should read again. Richard stared at her. For the first time that evening, he was not looking at a waitress. He was looking at a problem. And Avery knew the next few seconds would decide whether he listened to her or whether he learned the truth after it was too late. Richard Calloway leaned back in his chair and looked at Avery as if she had just interrupted a conversation that had nothing to do with her. Around the table, the people who had been listening to him a moment earlier shifted their attention toward her. His chief financial officer, Michael Grant, lowered his glass. A senior attorney named Laura Bennett glanced at the contract, then back at Avery. Richard noticed both reactions. You are a waitress, he said. I am aware of what I am signing. Avery did not move. Then you will not mind reading page 37 again. Richard's expression hardened. He lifted the contract between two fingers. Do you know how many contracts I have signed in my career? No, Avery said. But I know what this clause does. The answer landed differently than he expected. There was no anger in her voice. No attempt to impress anyone. Just certainty. Richard gave a short laugh and looked toward his guests. This is exactly what I mean. People see a document and suddenly think they understand the entire deal. Avery felt the old familiar pressure behind her ribs. It was not fear. It was the memory of every time someone had decided what she could understand before asking what she actually knew. Richard looked back at her. You serve drinks. My attorneys handle the legal language. Avery glanced toward the contract. Then your attorneys should have caught it. The room went still. Michael Grant stopped moving. Laura Bennett reached for the document. Richard's face changed slightly. What exactly are you suggesting? Avery pointed toward the middle of the open page without touching it. The indemnity clause. The wording on the second paragraph. Richard looked down. That is standard. Not in that structure. You are telling me a clause in a merger agreement is wrong because you read it while carrying a tray? Avery's voice remained calm. I am telling you that the company you are acquiring may be transferring responsibility for liabilities you believe are excluded. Richard stared at her. For a moment, the polished confidence he carried so naturally seemed to meet something it could not simply dismiss. Then he smiled again, but this time there was less warmth in it. You have no idea what you are talking about. Avery looked at the table, the leather portfolio, the untouched glass of water, the contract that had nearly become a signature. She could feel every pair of eyes on her. One wrong word, and she would become exactly what Richard had already decided she was, an employee who had stepped beyond her place. But she had not come back to win an argument. She had come back because she knew what happened when people ignored warnings simply because they came from the wrong person. I hope I am wrong, she said. Richard's fingers tightened around the pen. Then leave. Avery looked at him for one quiet second. Read the clause before you sign. Richard shook his head. Get her out of here. Daniel, the manager, appeared almost immediately. Avery. She looked at him, then at Richard. The room had already made its choice. She placed her notepad against her side and stepped back. But before she turned away, she took a small card from her pocket and placed it on the edge of the table. Richard glanced at it. On the front was her name, Avery Johnson. Underneath it, in smaller letters, was an old professional designation he did not notice. Compliance analyst. Richard pushed the card aside without reading it. Avery walked away. Behind her, the conversation slowly resumed. The glasses moved again. The voices returned. Richard picked up his pen, but the words she had spoken remained in the room. Read the clause before you sign. He looked at page 37. Then, despite himself, he began to read. Richard read the clause once. Then he read it again. The first time, he saw what he expected to see. The second time, he noticed the words Avery had warned him about. His eyes moved slowly across the page. The conversation around him continued, but he no longer heard every word. "What is it?" Michael Grant asked. Richard did not answer immediately. Laura Bennett leaned closer to the document. "Let me see that." Richard passed it to her. She read the paragraph, then turned to the next page. Her expression changed. "Richard, we need to pause." The room went quiet again. "Why?" he asked. Laura looked at the contract. "Because the liability language is broader than the summary we were given." Michael reached for the document. "That cannot be right. We reviewed the summary 3 times." "The summary is not the agreement," Laura said. Richard looked toward the doorway. Avery was gone. The manager had already guided her back toward the main dining room. Richard felt an unfamiliar irritation rise in him. Not because the contract had a problem. Not even because Avery had been right. It was because she had been right after he had made it clear that he did not believe she belonged at his table. He looked down at the card she had left behind. Avery Johnson, compliance analyst. The words sat beneath her name, plain and unremarkable. Richard picked it up. "Who is she?" he asked. "Daniel." The manager stood nearby with an uncomfortable expression. "Avery? She has been with us for about a year." "I did not ask how long she has worked here." Richard looked at the card again. "I asked who she is." Daniel hesitated. "She used to work in corporate compliance." Richard's eyes lifted. "Used to? Before she came here. Why did she leave?" Daniel gave a small shrug. "I never asked." Richard looked back at the contract. The words seemed sharper now. The clause was not a minor technicality. If the acquisition went through as written, Richard's company could inherit several unresolved claims connected to the target company. The potential exposure was not a few $1,000s. It could reach tens of millions. Laura picked up her phone. "I am calling our outside counsel." Richard did not stop her. His confidence had not disappeared, but something inside it had cracked. He remembered the way Avery had stood there. She had not asked for praise. She had not tried to embarrass him. She had simply told him to read the clause. And he had answered by telling her to leave. Richard looked through the dining room. Avery was moving between tables again, carrying plates, checking on guests, doing the work he had decided made her unworthy of respect. A family at the next table thanked her. She smiled politely. Richard watched the exchange. He had spent his entire life believing that important people were easy to recognize. They wore expensive suits. They sat at private tables. They signed documents worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet the person who had noticed the danger in his contract was standing under warm restaurant lights with a notepad in her hand. "Bring her back," Richard said. Daniel looked uncertain. "Mr. Calloway, she is working." Richard's jaw tightened. For years, people had moved the moment he gave an instruction. But this time, he stopped himself. He looked toward the doorway where Avery had disappeared. Then he said, more quietly, "Please ask her if she would be willing to come back." Daniel turned away. Richard lowered his eyes to the contract. For the first time that evening, the man who believed he controlled every room was waiting for someone he had just dismissed to decide whether she would return. Daniel found Avery near the service station, arranging clean glasses beneath the warm glow of the dining room lights. "Avery," he said carefully, "Mr. Calloway would like to speak with you." She did not look up immediately. "Would he like to speak with me? Or does he want me to return to his table?" Daniel paused. "He asked if you would be willing to come back." Avery placed the last glass on the tray. "That is different." Daniel nodded. "Yes." She looked across the restaurant. Richard was still seated at the private table, but the atmosphere around him had changed. His guests were no longer laughing. The contract lay open. His pen was no longer moving. Avery could see Laura Bennett speaking quietly with Michael Grant, while Richard watched the doorway. She knew exactly what had happened. He had finally read the clause. Avery wiped her hands with a clean towel and walked back toward the table. Richard saw her coming. He straightened in his chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "You were right about the language." Avery looked at the contract. "I know." One of the guests shifted uncomfortably. Richard noticed. "You could have explained yourself more clearly." Avery met his eyes. "I tried." The sentence was simple. It carried the entire evening with it. Richard looked down at the table. He had spent decades mastering negotiations, controlling meetings, and making people wait for his attention. He was not used to being reminded that he had already been given an opportunity to listen. How did you know? He asked. Avery glanced at the contract. I worked in compliance. I saw the card. Then you know. Richard's expression tightened. I did not know what you were doing here. Avery looked around the restaurant. Working. The answer made Michael glance away. Richard's face grew colder. You understand that this is a serious business matter. Yes. And you understand that you are not part of this transaction. Yes. Then you understand why I questioned your involvement. Avery held his gaze. I understand why you questioned my involvement. I do not understand why you decided my value before you heard what I had to say. The table went silent. Richard had no immediate answer. He could have dismissed her again. He could have reminded her that the restaurant was his private dining room and that the contract belonged to his company. He could have used his position to end the conversation. Instead, he looked at the document. What exactly do you think we missed? Avery pulled out the chair across from him, but did not sit. The indemnity language connects certain liabilities to the acquiring company. The summary describes the exposure as limited. The agreement does not. Laura Bennett nodded slowly. That is what I am seeing. Richard turned toward her. How serious? Laura took a breath. Serious enough that we should not sign tonight. The words settled over the table. Richard looked at Avery again. The person he had tried to remove from his table had just prevented him from approving a transaction that could have cost his company tens of millions of dollars. Yet instead of feeling grateful, he felt something more uncomfortable. He felt exposed. Not financially, personally, because the problem was no longer only the contract. It was the way he had treated the one person who had noticed it. Richard leaned back. You could have let me sign. Avery's voice softened. I could have. Why did you not? She looked at him for a moment. Because being treated without respect does not give me a reason to let someone make a mistake that could hurt other people. Richard stared at her. The sentence was not dramatic. It did not need to be. Then his eyes moved to the contract again. You said the wording was familiar. Avery nodded. It is. Richard's expression changed. Where have you seen it before? Avery looked toward the glass doors leading to the street. Outside, Manhattan traffic moved beneath the evening lights. In a case involving one of your suppliers. Richard's attention sharpened. Which supplier? Avery turned back to him. The one your company removed from a contract last year. Richard went completely still. Avery continued. The same structure was used there. And suddenly, the problem on page 37 was no longer the only thing Richard needed to understand. Avery did not say anything else. She simply looked at Richard and waited. The dining room seemed to have grown quieter, although the city outside continued moving beyond the glass. Headlights passed across the windows. Somewhere near the bar, a glass touched a countertop. A server whispered an order. The ordinary sounds of the restaurant continued, but at Richard's table, everything had slowed. He looked down at the contract again. Then he looked at Avery's card. Compliance analyst. He had read the words before, but he had not really seen them. He had seen the uniform first. The position. The assumptions that came with it. Avery stepped away from the table. I have another section to cover, she said. Richard looked up. Wait. She stopped. What? He seemed to search for the right words, which was unusual for a man who always appeared to have them ready. Tell me about the supplier. Avery remained standing. Why? Because you said the same structure was used. It was. And your company removed them from a contract? Avery looked toward the window. The lights of Manhattan reflected across the glass, breaking into long golden lines. Your company did. Richard studied her face. You were involved? Not directly. Then how do you know? Avery took a slow breath. Because I reviewed the documents after the decision. Richard leaned forward. For whom? For the supplier. The answer settled between them. Richard remembered the company, a small logistics firm that had served one of his divisions for nearly a decade. The contract had ended after an internal review. His executives had told him the decision was necessary. Efficient. Clean. No serious concerns. He had approved it without reading every detail. That was what senior executives did, he had once believed. They trusted the people beneath them to handle the details. Avery watched his expression change. They contacted me after the contract ended, she said. They believed the language had been used against them. And was it? Richard asked. Avery did not answer immediately. She looked at the table, at the contract that had brought them to this moment. The language was written in a way that gave your company protection while leaving the other side responsible for risks they could not reasonably control. Richard's fingers rested against the edge of the document. Are you saying the decision was improper? I am saying the decision deserved a closer review. Richard looked toward Laura. Did we review it? Laura's expression was careful. I was not involved in that matter. Michael shifted in his chair. Richard noticed. Michael. Michael looked down. It was handled by the operations team. That was not my question. The room became quiet again. Michael finally said, the legal team approved the structure. Avery watched Richard absorb the answer. She could see the old version of him trying to return. The executive who could end a conversation with one sentence. The man who could turn a complicated problem into someone else's responsibility. But something had changed. The document in front of him was connected to another document. And that document was connected to a company he had dismissed as a business decision. Richard looked at Avery. What happened to the supplier? Avery's voice became softer. They closed 6 months later. Richard said nothing. The restaurant lights reflected in the dark surface of the table. Avery could have told him more. She could have explained how many employees had depended on that company. She could have described the months of uncertainty that followed. But she did not need to. The silence was already doing the work. Richard looked at the contract again. For the first time, he understood that the words on a page did not remain on the page. They moved into people's homes, into paychecks, into futures. Avery picked up her notepad. You should have your attorneys review everything before you sign. Richard looked up. Avery. She waited. He wanted to say thank you. The words felt too small. He wanted to apologize. The apology felt too early. So he said the only thing he could manage. I did not know. Avery nodded once. That is why people need to listen before they decide. Then she walked away. Richard remained at the table, surrounded by expensive suits, polished silverware, and a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet the only thing he could hear was the quiet sound of his own assumptions beginning to fall apart. Richard did not touch the contract again for several seconds. The room around him continued to move, but he remained still, his eyes fixed on the page where Avery had found the problem. The words were the same as before. The ink had not changed. The paper had not changed. Only the person reading it had. Laura Bennett was speaking with outside counsel on the phone, asking questions in a voice that had become increasingly serious. Michael Grant sat with his hands folded, avoiding Richard's eyes. Richard noticed that too. How long has this language been used? He asked. Michael looked up. I would need to check. Check. Michael reached for his phone. Richard looked toward the dining room again. Avery was serving another table. A couple thanked her as she placed their meals in front of them. She smiled, nodded, and moved on. She did not look back at him. Richard watched her for a moment longer than he intended. Then Laura ended the call. We need to stop the transaction tonight, she said. Richard turned toward her. How serious is it? Serious enough that the agreement needs a complete review. How much exposure? Laura hesitated. The preliminary estimate could be between $20 million and $40 million, depending on the unresolved claims. The number landed heavily. Richard had built his career around numbers. He understood what $40 million could do. It could erase a quarter's earnings. It could trigger investigations. It could damage investor confidence. It could change the future of the company. But the money was not what held his attention. He kept thinking about Avery's first warning. She had not asked for anything. She had not demanded a reward. She had simply seen a problem and chosen to speak. Richard looked at the small card beside his hand. Avery Johnson, compliance analyst. He turned it over. On the back, written in blue ink, was a phone number and a sentence. Ask better questions. Richard read it twice. Who wrote that? Laura asked. She did. Laura looked toward the dining room. She is the waitress? Richard nodded. Laura stared at him. You told her to leave? Richard did not answer. He did not need to. Laura understood. Richard. Her voice was quiet now. You need to speak with her. I know. But before he could stand, Michael's phone rang. He answered, listened, and his expression changed. Richard. Richard looked at him. What? Michael lowered the phone. The supplier she mentioned. The one from last year. Richard waited. Their former owner filed a complaint months ago. It was closed without a full review. Richard felt the room become smaller. Who closed it? Michael looked down at the table. Our internal compliance department. Richard's eyes moved toward Avery. She was standing near the far side of the dining room, speaking with a young employee who had been carrying a stack of menus. The employee nodded, then looked toward Richard's table. Avery did not. Richard understood then that she had not come back to help him because he was important. She had come back because someone had to say something. And now he was beginning to understand the real lesson. The problem was not that he had failed to recognize Avery's intelligence. The problem was that he had built an entire world where he did not have to recognize people like her at all. Richard stood. His guests watched him. "Where are you going?" Michael asked. Richard looked toward the dining room. "To apologize." Michael seemed surprised. Richard almost smiled. But there was no humor in it. "No," he said. "That is not enough." He walked away from the table. Avery was near the service station, checking an order. Richard stopped several feet away and waited. For the first time in his professional life, he did not interrupt someone who was working. He waited until she finished. Avery looked up and saw him. Richard opened his mouth. Then he stopped. The words he had used all evening came back to him. "You are a waitress. People like you. Get her out of here." He had believed those words disappeared the moment they were spoken. Now he understood that words could remain long after the person who said them had forgotten. Avery looked at him calmly. Richard finally said, "I was wrong." Avery did not answer. He continued, "About the contract, about the supplier, and about you." The dining room seemed to grow quiet around them. Avery held his gaze. Richard had expected relief, perhaps gratitude. Instead, she simply asked, "Which one of those are you going to fix first?" Richard's question remained between them. "Which one of those are you going to fix first?" Avery asked. He looked at her, and for once, there was no prepared answer waiting behind his eyes. He had spent years solving problems by assigning them to departments, attorneys, consultants, and executives. But this was different. The first problem was standing in front of him. "The way I treated you," he said. Avery did not soften. "That is the easiest one." Richard looked down. She was right. An apology could take less than a minute. A company could release a statement, schedule a meeting, and call the matter resolved. But the other problems would require more than words. "Then the supplier," he said. Avery nodded once. "And the contract?" "Yes." Richard glanced toward the private dining room, where his guests were still waiting. "I will have the transaction paused tonight." "You should. And I will order a review of the supplier case." Avery's expression remained calm. "An internal review?" Richard hesitated. "An independent one." That answer seemed to matter. Avery placed her notepad on the counter. "Good." Richard studied her. "You knew this would happen when you came back to the table. I knew you might listen. You were not certain." "No, why did you give me another chance?" Avery looked at him. The restaurant lights reflected softly across the polished counter between them. "I did not give you a chance," she said. "I gave the truth a chance." Richard was quiet. The sentence stayed with him. He had always believed that forgiveness was something powerful people offered when they decided someone had earned it. Avery had just shown him another possibility. Sometimes the person who had been dismissed did not need permission to remain dignified. Sometimes they simply refused to become cruel. Richard looked toward the dining room. "I want you to come to the company tomorrow." Avery raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "To review the supplier file." "You want me to review your company's work?" "I want you to tell us what we missed." Avery considered him. "And if I find more?" Richard answered without hesitation this time. "Then we fix more. Even if it makes you look bad?" Richard looked down at the floor for a moment. "Especially then." Avery studied his face. The man who had dismissed her earlier was still standing there. The expensive suit had not changed. The company had not changed. The power was still his. But something in the way he stood had shifted. He was no longer speaking as if every answer belonged to him. "I am not interested in being used as a symbol," Avery said. Richard nodded. "I understand." "Do you?" She looked directly at him. "Because hiring one black woman after treating her badly does not fix a culture that taught you to treat her that way in the first place." Richard absorbed the words. They were difficult because they were true. "Then what would?" he asked. Avery looked toward the private dining room, where the contract still waited. "Start by asking who else you have not listened to." Richard followed her gaze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he returned to the table and told his guests the transaction was suspended. He did not blame the attorneys. He did not blame the paperwork. He did not describe Avery as a lucky employee who had happened to notice something important. He simply said that the company had failed to ask the right questions, and he had failed to listen when someone tried to warn him. The next morning, Richard called for an independent review of the supplier case, the acquisition agreement, and the internal process that had allowed both matters to pass without proper scrutiny. He also asked Avery to join the review team. She did not accept immediately. She gave him one condition. I need authority to report what I find without anyone editing the truth to protect the company. Richard looked at her. You have it. Avery nodded. Then I will consider it. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something Richard had never been required to earn before. Trust. And for the first time, he understood that a sincere apology was not the end of a lesson. It was the moment the real work finally began. A few months later, the private dining room looked almost exactly the same. The same polished tables stood beneath the warm lights. The same glass doors reflected the movement of Manhattan outside. The same restaurant staff moved quietly through the evening, carrying plates, answering questions, and doing work most people noticed only when something went wrong. But Richard Calloway was not the same man who had walked into that room before. The acquisition had never been signed. The independent review had uncovered more than the original clause. The supplier case had been reopened, and the company had acknowledged that its internal process had failed to properly examine the decision. Richard had not fixed everything with one apology. He had learned that change did not arrive like a speech. It arrived in meetings where uncomfortable questions were allowed to remain in the room. It arrived when someone without a title could challenge someone with one. It arrived when the person with the most power was expected to listen first. Avery Johnson had joined the independent review team, but only after Richard accepted her condition. She had authority to report what she found without changing the truth to protect the company. Some executives resisted her. Some questioned her experience. Some still looked at her and saw the uniform she had, once worn instead of the knowledge she carried. But this time, Richard did not allow the old pattern to continue. Not because Avery needed him to defend her. She did not. He did it because he finally understood that silence from a powerful person could become permission. One evening, Richard returned to the restaurant. He was no longer there for a private acquisition meeting. He had come to speak with the manager about a community partnership the company was funding. Near the entrance, a young black woman stood holding a folder. She looked nervous. Daniel, the manager, was reviewing her application. Richard recognized the expression on her face. He had seen it on Avery months earlier. The careful posture, the quiet patience, the awareness that one wrong assumption from someone else could close a door before she ever had the chance to explain who she was. Daniel glanced at the folder. We usually look for someone with a certain presentation, he began. Richard stopped a few feet away. The young woman lowered her eyes. Avery was seated near the window, reviewing documents for the next meeting. She looked up. Richard looked at Daniel. What does that mean? Daniel paused. I was only saying, I heard what you were saying. The room became quiet. Richard did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He looked at the young woman. Please finish your application. Then he turned back to Daniel. And next time, ask about her qualifications before you decide what she represents. Across the room, Avery watched without speaking. Richard noticed her. For a moment, their eyes met. There was no applause. No dramatic celebration. No perfect ending that erased everything that had happened before. Avery simply gave him a small nod. Richard returned it. Then she looked back down at her papers. The young woman continued speaking with Daniel. The restaurant resumed its quiet rhythm. A glass was placed on a table. A door opened. City light moved across the floor. Richard stood near the entrance, listening to a conversation he once would have ignored. And Avery sat by the window, no longer invisible, though she had never truly been. The lesson Richard would never forget was not that a waitress had known more than a CEO. It was that he had been so certain he knew a person's value that he nearly missed the truth standing directly in front of him. He had believed respect belonged to people who had earned a certain position. Avery had shown him that respect was not a reward handed down by the powerful. It was the starting point. Outside, Manhattan continued moving beneath the evening sky. Inside, Avery closed her folder and stood. Richard stepped aside to let her pass. This time, neither of them needed to say anything. The space between them was no longer filled with assumptions. It was filled with understanding. And as Avery walked toward the light near the glass doors, Richard remained where he was, finally learning what she had known all along. Kindness was never weakness. Sometimes, it was the strength to tell the truth when no one had asked for it. Sometimes, it was the courage to help someone who had refused to respect you. And sometimes, The most powerful lesson a person could ever receive came from the person they had been too proud to see.